I'm Jeff Mays of the New York Times, sitting in for Sam Roberts. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, we explore a potential Christian backlash against Trump as faith leaders turn on his domestic policy and feature one law professor's call for governors to use clemency powers more boldly to address mass incarceration. But first, let's turn to transit, as the city's subway system was stifled this week once again by flash flooding, with congestion pricing programs shaping traffic flows and fiscal debates looming over who pays and who benefits. Zohran Mamdani's push for fare-free buses has again ignited citywide conversation. Joining me to explain the policy fights, the impacts on daily riders, and the political ramifications is Stefanos Chen, New York Times reporter covering the city's transit system and congestion pricing plans. Welcome, Stefanos.
Thanks for having me.
So we had a major event today, this week, a major rainstorm, and it had some implications for the city's subway system, right?
Yeah, this is looking familiar to folks who are on their TikTok or Instagram around this time of year. This is now the third or fourth year where there's been one of these viral moments that have gone out of a train station inundated with water. The one train, 28th Street station on 7th Avenue, was the one this year that took the crown. If you'd seen this is essentially a geyser of brown water shooting out from the platform. There's water seeping onto the train. And it's alarming to folks, especially if that's your commute every day, to have that happen after heavy rains.
And the MTA has raised the issue of climate resiliency. They've spent billions of dollars so far to address it. I'm wondering, is there coordination between New York City and the MTA in addressing some of the concerns around climate resiliency?
I think to the MTA's credit, yes, that billions have been spent already on this system, but people have to remember that this is over a century old, the subway. It's this huge, porous, cavernous maze. There are stalactites on the ceilings. It feels, old. And to that point, I think they're doing their best as an agency to put money where it needs to go. In the next capital plan, which is over the next 5 years, there's $700 million dedicated just to patching up leaks and fixing subway entrances. But their own admission is that's not enough. There's going to be the need for billions more and perhaps decades more to really get this place where it's at least not soaking wet in heavy rains.
So the city's climate policy chief officer said yesterday that they have repairs underway. The problem is that these repairs are expensive, and they will take time. He cited one sewer project that could take almost a decade to actually fix. So I'm wondering, are riders going to be stuck dealing with this over the next decade as the city works to sort of improve conditions?
The short answer is yes, just in the sense that there is no quick fix. The MTA can throw money at it, and they've done a good job in many ways in shoring up the stations. But you also need multi-agency cooperation. You need Department of Transportation to fix some of the curbs that allow the floodwater into the stations. You need environmental protection to fix these sewers that you were referencing. New York has this very archaic system where we have a single pipe that has both sewage and other water. And when it rains, that stuff backs up. And that's what you're seeing when these geysers shoot up and when some of this flooding seems to appear out of nowhere underground.
Let's move above ground a bit and talk about buses. Zohran Mamdani, who's the Democratic nominee for mayor, has made fast, free buses part of his campaign pitch to voters. Can he actually accomplish that?
It's a great question, and I think one that's unsettled. It's interesting, and I think it has been very helpful to Mr. Mamdani in his campaign. He's given free and fast buses basically equal platform space with free childcare, with fair rents. And I think really putting those three planks on an equal playing field shows folks that he's really committed to this message of affordability. That said, I think that the bus population, there's over 1 million daily riders on it. It's very popular in the outer boroughs. It's a lower income ridership typically. So there's a clear understanding that these are folks who could use the help. I mean, it's costly to take this bus every day. And at the same time, potentially make it faster. That's the hope.
I've been surprised by the backlash to this proposal from Mr. Mamdani. It's upset a lot of people for some reason. I'm wondering, when it comes to actually eliminating bus fares, like what are the pros and cons? Will the MTA be able to raise enough revenue if it did eliminate bus fares?
It's interesting because the MTA is a state agency, And this plan, anytime you hear the word free, it's going to mean typically you need to find revenue elsewhere, which is tax increases. And Governor Hochul has said that she does not want to raise taxes. So there is the first obstacle. The MTA as an agency as well has a lot of other things happening at the same time. So this is sort of a headache for them to consider when they have this campaign to reduce fare evasion in the network. Fare revenue in New York City for the buses last year was over $800 million. It's expected to be closer to $1 billion every year to come in. And that's money that the MTA very much needs for its operating budget and also for these other projects that they have down the line. So to give up that annual revenue without a clear way of paying for that, and perhaps Governor Hochul not being on board with that right now, it makes this path unclear.
Congestion pricing, you talked about raising revenue. That has been one of the biggest proposals for raising revenue. What's the status now? I know they were facing a few lawsuits, and there's been still debate about whether it's going forward, but it does seem to be working, right?
Yes, so here is, I think, an interesting tie-in with the buses. The first year of congestion pricing is supposed to bring in $500 million in tolls. Buses alone is going to be almost double that in a few years. So you're really talking about, there's this huge fight over congestion pricing and the money that's going to bring in, which the MTA desperately needs. So just to tie it back into the buses, that's a lot of money that the MTA is not likely to want to let go of. Congestion pricing as a policy has been hugely impactful in the city. We wrote a piece a few weeks ago looking at how much has actually changed. It's very rare you have a policy that has such an immediate impact. Traffic is down during the highest tolling period in central Manhattan. Businesses have not been hurt. In fact, foot traffic remains the same or higher in some places. There's evidence that this is making people's commutes faster. Overall, it's a winning policy, it seems. And there is this lawsuit now. It's been going on now since January. It's been active, the program, in which the U.S. Department of Transportation is trying to actively end the program. And as more time goes on, it seems likelier that this is here to stay.
And the Trump administration seems intent on pursuing the ending of congestion pricing.
Yes, and the case is ongoing. It is still in the Southern District of New York being decided. We may not get a decision, though, probably until late summer to early fall. But the judge in that case has indicated that he thinks that the state has the right to proceed with this case. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out.
Finally, what can riders expect? I mean, are we going to see expansion of the system? I know there's this interborough line that Governor Hochul has talked about a bit. What's next? Are we going to get some new subway lines, or is service going to improve? What's in the future?
Well, the capital plan I referenced earlier, the next 5-year plan, the largest that they ever received, $68 billion, has money put aside for this interborough express, which is it's going to be a pretty revolutionary idea in that it's going to connect neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn without ever going through Manhattan. It's going to be a light rail train system, mostly above ground on this freight railroad cut that already exists. And it could really revolutionize, a lot of things in that part of New York. Lots of areas that are typically considered transit deserts. And you also have a bunch of money going to the extension of the 2nd Avenue line that extending into Harlem, which is another big city-changing development.
Great. A lot to look forward to. Thank you, Stefanos. All of New York is looking forward to your continued reporting on the issue. Coming up, the major rift emerging within Trump's core political base, Christians. For years, white evangelicals and conservative Christians have been Donald Trump's strongest supporters. But after Trump's latest domestic policy bill, now facing a wave of sharp united criticism from Catholic, Black, and evangelical church leaders, some faithful are finally pushing back, citing moral and biblical concerns about the harm to the poor. Is this the start of a real Christian backlash against Trump, or will his coalition hold? Here to break this down, this shift, and what it means is Esau McCaulley, New York Times opinion writer and podcast host, who sits at the intersection of faith and politics. Welcome, Esau.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So this was a great column, but you call this a rare backlash against Donald Trump. What has been his support so far?
Well, the rare thing is the fact that everybody seemed to be in a consensus. From the beginning, there have been elements of the Black church that have spoken about kind of the anti-Black racism that happens a lot in the administration. You actually have portions of the Catholic Church who push back on some of the immigration policies. But it's rare to have evangelicals, Black church leaders, mainline church leaders, and everybody basically all uniting against this bill. And so that's what was rare, is the fact that basically most of Christendom in the United States, elements of it had issues with this bill.
And so this domestic policy bill, the administration used a Bible verse, right, to support the passage of this bill, which was an unusual usage. But there was a strong pushback to that use, right?
Yeah, so shortly after the bill, Speaker Johnson quoted a verse from the Bible that says, "All of this is from God who gave us the ministry of reconciliation." And he used the Bible to say that, God had used them to reconcile the different parts of this bill, when the Bible verse in question actually speaks about people being reconciled to God. And so there are a lot of Christians who are upset to see the use of this particular passage that talks about God and humans being reconciled, talk about the two houses of Congress, and the fact that this particular bill did tremendous damage to the poor as relates to cutting Medicaid coverage. And so to use the Bible verse to support a bill that's going to disproportionately impact the poor, where a central teaching of Christianity is a concern for the poor, is why there was united opposition to it.
I'm wondering, do you think maybe not just faith leaders, but regular congregants see the contradiction in using a Bible verse to justify cuts to the poor and prosecuting immigrants?
One of the things that is difficult is that a lot of people aren't as online as we are. It's our job to pay attention to this. And so it's really getting this truth out to the people in the pews. And so that's the reason that writing and clergy speaking up and explaining to people what's going on. Because I sent it I heard about it because a group of friends of mine put it in a text stream. That's how this article came about. I was like, whoa. And then somebody else in that text stream then sent me the video with the recruitment to use the other passage. And so it's really, I think, word of mouth that is getting people aware of the things that are happening that people who don't follow the White House Twitter feed might miss.
You didn't necessarily address this in your column, but there's been a lot of concern about the rise of white Christian nationalism and how that's playing into the administration's use of Christianity. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that.
So it's always the language of rise I've always found complicated, because one of the things that I found interesting is that if I pull a quote from Frederick Douglass from like the 1800s, this is directly relevant. If I pull an MLK quote that dealt with what he dealt with, it is directly relevant. And so what we're calling white Christian nationalism now, to me, is this same old monster that stalked the Republic from the beginning. The same way that people use the Bible to justify slavery, and the same way people use the Bible to justify segregation, you have this same use of scripture and Christianity to justify oppression. And every single time that's happened, there's been elements of the Black church and people of no religion at all who recognize and say, I might not even be a person of faith, but this is seen like something that God would support. So yes, I would say a recurrence, but I don't think what's happening in our generation is at all new. That's how you have the birth of a nation. All of these things that if you kind of go back and say, this feels shockingly relevant. So yes, I do think there's an issue of Christian nationalism, but that's just a new name for an old phenomenon.
Staying on Douglass for a second, he made this strong distinction between performative faith and sort of justice-driven faith. Maybe you could tell us about that, how that might apply in this situation.
Yeah, so Frederick Douglass, some of his strongest writing was actually during this time of the Fugitive Slave Law. And the Fugitive Slave Law said that any slave who was free anywhere had to be returned to their master in the South. And Frederick Douglass tried to argue that actually that's a violation of religious freedom. So if you're saying to me in the North that I have to take a slave and send it back, that's violating my Christian principles. He said, if you don't think that it violates Christian principles, then it's only treating religion as this empty ceremony instead of the act of doing good. And so Frederick was actually arguing, believe it or not, for a religious exemption for a Christian to be able to house fugitive slaves. And so when you then fast forward to this moment and we think about religious freedom today, we tend to think of it in the way that Frederick Douglass criticized, namely only a concern with the ability to gather and have services, which is important, but not the Christian ability to do good. And so if we simply reduce Christianity to the public, to just ceremonies, then Frederick Douglass would say that's not the Christianity of Christ.
Right. Does this feel to you like just a temporary backlash, or is this the beginning of a complete break of the Christian right from the Trump administration?
I think it is our job in every generation to tell the truth. And we have to tell the truth regardless of outcome, right? And so whether or not I have hope that this is going to lead to a real transformation or like a breaking of the coalition, that's beyond my control. All I can do as a writer and as a human being is to say, this is something that's happening in society. People ought to know about it. And hopefully by getting that information, they'll begin to resist. And if it just changes the hearts and minds of a few people to help them resist some of the worst parts of this legislation, then I feel like I've done my job. I think that if we stop at every moment and ask, will this work? Then we're just never going to get anywhere. Right. Sometimes like the whole point of hope is when the evidence runs the other way. Like the point of being hopeful is to say, the evidence around me suggests that this is not going to be successful, but my convictions lead me forward. And so by conviction, I hope that there are people of faith who see what is happening through this law and resist it. And I'm going to do whatever I can to raise that voice.
Are there any indications from the Trump administration that they are taking what's happening within their Christian conservative base seriously and are worried? And how might they address some of the concerns being raised by even some of their Christian supporters?
I think that whenever this happens, and we'll probably have to wait for another week or two, they usually find some way to distract the people who are upset. So they'll throw another worship service in the White House, or maybe they'll put a Bible verse somewhere. So normally it's just the attempt is to wait out the news cycle. But these things actually have long-term implications. And what I think is really clear, because we often think about the Trump administration, but this is his last term. So what we're really looking for is the midterm. I mean, it's on this level, it's too late to say you can resist Trump. He's won the second election. What you can say is that the vulnerable people in the House in the midterms might suffer the consequences of this bill. Because even something as simple as like the CCCU, which is the Coalition for Christian Colleges and Universities, who were upset about the education provisions in this bill. Like there's been a lot of different people who are looking and seeing what's happening. And so what I think you might see, rather than like some clear rejection of Trump, is some people who are in vulnerable seats at the midterm might lose their place. And if that happens, then we'll be in a different spot rather than, the administration controlling both houses and the executive branch.
I'm wondering, with the sort of agreement between, you talk about the breakdown between Black Christians, Catholics, et cetera, sort of agreement that this bill is not biblical. I'm wondering, could this be the start of a new realignment amongst those groups where they more focus?
Yeah. So I think historically, people have not always taken economic policy it's hard to always see clearly economic policy from a religious perspective, because people can have different ways of going about how to serve the poor. But I think that this bill was so egregious in some of the cuts that it made, there's basically no justification for it, right? Like, and so I think that may allow Christians who disagree on other things to say, what we actually do care about is the humane treatment of the migrant. What we do care about is actually giving people a fair shot at education where they can thrive. We do care about is that people have health care. Now, everybody knows somebody who's sick, right? And so I think that gives us a chance to have a coalition around the places where we agree. And that's what is actually hopeful for me. It's the fact that everybody was able to see clearly the economic implications of this. And I don't even think it would have happened if it was just tax cuts. Because people can argue about tax cuts, but it was the tax cuts coupled with the reduction of services to the poor that has made it like a beacon for anybody who's concerned with people who are suffering.
Well, we'll keep monitoring the situation. Thank you, Esau, for your thought-provoking piece.
Thank you so much for having me on.
My final guest made an urgent call for justice this week. While President Trump has been criticized for his controversial use of clemency, many governors might also be criticized for using their own powers too sparingly. Joining me now is Steve Zeidman, professor at the CUNY School of Law, whose guest essay in the Times this week makes the case for clemency in addressing America's mass incarceration crisis. Welcome, Steve.
Glad to be with you.
And so the point of your article is that governors are not using clemency enough. Why is that?
To me, it's a political calculation. You know, it's an interesting thing, and it's something that I don't think people are aware of. Most governors have the power. When I say the power, it's in the state constitution, New York being one example, where they can issue clemency grants, meaning commute someone's sentence, grant a pardon. They don't need a commission. They don't need legislation. They could do it tomorrow, but they're just afraid to do it. They're afraid of being labeled soft on crime. And so to me, there's no other way to put it other than it's political and it's cowardice.
How is Governor Kathy Hochul doing? You mentioned that there are over 1,000 backlogs for clemency requests, but she's only granted one commutation last year.
To say it's disappointing is an understatement. You know, and I'm trying not to resort to hyperbole, but I will say this. Early in her tenure as governor, she did something that was extraordinary. She said she was going to give clemency on a rolling or ongoing basis. You know, typically it's been Christmas Eve. It's supposed to be sort of a gift, benevolence, mercy, and the like. She promised she was going to do it on an ongoing rolling basis, and the next year she sort of did. Not enough, but it was scattered throughout the year. But now we're going on 13 months, and there's only been one person who's had their sentence commuted, and there are exactly as you said, there are actually over 1,100 clemency applications on her desk. And if I could, those clemency applications, what I think it's important for people to understand, those have been vetted, not by me, not by an independent, by the governor's own staff. So these are applications that have been looked at for sometimes 2-3 years, gone over with a fine-tooth comb, reached out to victims' families, reached out to the prosecutor. They're just sitting there waiting for the governor to act.
Wow. I'm wondering with President Trump's use of pardons, you know, pardoning the January 6 rioters, for example, I'm wondering, is there like a concern over the misuse of pardons, for example? And is that part of the concern weighing into the governor's lack of usage of this power?
As a matter of fact, it's the misuse of presidential pardon power, the clemency power. That is what everybody thinks of when they hear the word clemency. And that's a problem. And has it been misused by, not just by Trump, but by others? Of course it has. And again, when Trump began to do this and pardon cronies and insurrectionists and campaign contributors, what that promoted immediately was people saying, we have to get rid of clemency, we have to cut back on clemency, and I think they were missing the point. It's there for a reason. It's historical. It's in the state constitution. George Washington used the clemency power. Alexander Hamilton talked about clemency. So the bigger problem for me, it's not what Trump was doing. It's why isn't it being used appropriately for all the people who are really just languishing in prison.
Right. You mentioned this as a sort of political problem. You know, that governors may feel that they'll be branded as not tough on crime if they grant clemencies.
Exactly.
But talk a little bit about the benefit of granting clemency.
Here's the other thing about this is when you look at governors, when they actually do it, the fear that they have that there's going to be this political price to pay is so overblown and overstated. Because at the end of the day, and I think this gets to the root of your question, when people come home, the recidivism rates starting there for people who've been in 20, 30 years, and I'm talking about people who've been punished. These are folks who've been in for decades. The recidivism rate is basically non-existent. They become tax-paying citizens. They rebuild families, communities, and the incredible cost to the Department of Corrections as people get older is suddenly, you know, you take one person out, you're saving hundreds of thousands of dollars. So to me, you know, if you want to look at it economically as opposed to from a humane perspective, that's another reason, another thumb on the scale why we need to have greater use of clemency.
And clemency also addresses some of the racial disparities that we see in our criminal justice system, right?
Yeah, I'm so grateful for that question. Because if you go back historically, and people still talk about clemency, and I did use these sorts of words in that guest essay as mercy and forgiveness and an act of grace, which I think is all true. But actually, I think there's a more important reason, and that's to rectify. So we have a crisis of mass incarceration. That crisis of mass incarceration has overwhelmingly, disproportionately impacted black and brown communities. So this is an opportunity for governors to say, I have this power to try and rectify that. Because we have so many people serving what have come to be called death by incarceration sentences, these were all victims of the racist tropes of the super predator, of words like wilding and wolf pack. These are I think people are shocked when they hear in blue state New York how many teenagers, 16 and 17-year-olds, are doing 50 to life, 75 to life, life without parole. And they're now in their 50s, remarkably different people, yet nobody's paying any attention to them. And the one who should and can is the governor.
You would expect that in certain states, in certain political environments, that there would be this strong political resistance to using clemency. Are there any governors across the country that are actually exercising this power with the strength you think they should be?
Short answer, no. There are some who are using it, but even those, it's sparing. And by and large, they tend to go for, and I hate this phrase, but the low-hanging fruit. What's the easiest case? What's the most non-controversial case? And because this is what we have to address, and this is part of clemency. You know, the people who are serving the longest sentences, who are facing the reality of dying in prison, they committed very serious crimes, mostly homicide. So it's a serious question, a challenging question. Is someone going to be given another opportunity to live on the outside after they've taken a life?
I wrote an article a few years ago about a rapper named G. Depp who received, was it clemency or?
He received a sentence commutation.
Commutation,
yes.
of his sentence. And he had some his story was well known. He had murdered somebody and gotten away with it basically, but then confessed later and served time. He had some powerful advocates, Assemblyman Eddie Gibbs, who is one of the strongest prison advocates in the system. I'm wondering, what do people have to do to get commutations for people? Do you have to have a well-known case like G. Depp and advocates working for you? How can we get the unknown cases to have consideration?
Yeah, the unknown cases, that's the largest problem. You know, some of the early cases that I worked on where people received clemency, they had done remarkable things. They had remarkable support. I mean, I'll just give you one example. This is one of the first people who was given clemency by former Governor Cuomo. This was someone who was about to become the first New York State prisoner in history to earn a PhD while incarcerated. So his 475-page dissertation landed on that got everybody's attention. And I was thrilled for him when he got clemency, but I realized we just set the bar ridiculously high. What about that person who's been in for 35 years and is just putting one foot in front of the other? They're different, they're older, they're mature, there's no tickets, there's no problems inside. How do they come to anybody's attention? So I guess the bottom line is you certainly need an advocate. I don't know that you necessarily need high-profile advocates, but you do need someone to kind of take the case and try and make the case to the governor's people.
Is there an effort afoot to make this more of an issue, maybe in upcoming elections or?
There's an ongoing group, a small but mighty group of people who are advocates, and it's mostly impacted people, family members, who are saying, does my loved one have to perish in prison? Look what they've done, look what they've achieved, give them another opportunity to live on the outside. They have children, their parents are older. You know, that's the other part of this. When people come home, we have proof now. So from 2011 to 2015, the first couple of years of the Cuomo administration, there hadn't been a single sentence commutation. Since then, there have been 58 between Cuomo and Hochul. It's a drop in the bucket, but we can look at those 58 people. And when you do, you see them making contributions in so many ways to their families, to their communities, tending to sick and dying family members, but working as mentors, I mean, doing remarkable things. So you think someone would look at this and say, this is a resource. If these are 58 people, this is an example. What if we had 580 people? And I can promise you this, with 30,000 people in New York State Prison, there are easily 580 people who could make significant contributions on the outside.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. And thank you, Steve, for bringing a fresh perspective on mercy, reform, and redemption to our justice system. That's it for this edition of Close Up for the New York Times and CUNY TV. I'm Jeff May, sitting in for Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app, where you can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.